And when Baptists tell us that women must submit gracefully to the will of their husbands, they're going to say they're sorry about that. Believe me, they're going to say they're sorry about that in years to come. But in the meantime, we suffer. Look, I don't know whether God exists. I don't know that. And I tell you one thing, I am not frightened of my beliefs. If there is a God who is threatening me with damnation because I don't believe in him, so be it. I've lived my life in conscience, and I will suffer damnation willingly in conscience against a tyrannical God who would damn me because on the basis of intelligence he gave me, I have come to a conclusion doubting his existence. And I will continue to be a skeptic all of my life. I take no seat to you, Dr. Keynes, in my fight for human rights, in my struggle against tyranny. I went to the Soviet Union and fought for the right of dissidents without a Bible in my pocket. I went and fought for the right of dissidents because it was the right thing to do. I will continue to fight for human rights all through my life, on days when I believe, on days when I disbelieve, and on days when I am skeptical. Please don't misinform us about Thomas Jefferson and about the framers of our Constitution. You make a distinction between somebody who was a Christian and somebody who was an atheist. Of course Thomas Jefferson was not an atheist. Even Thomas Paine, who wrote The Age of Reason, which was a scathing attack on Christianity, Judaism, Islam, was not an atheist. He believed in God. They were deists. They were deists who opposed organized religion. You'll notice that the Constitution, the Declaration, particularly the Declaration of Independence, never mentions Christianity. Yes, it mentions nature's God, but it never mentions Christianity. It was a document designed as a document of revolution, a document of consensus. Of course it would have to mention unalienable rights. I wish there were unalienable rights. I wish there were natural rights. I wish I could invoke God's name and God's voice when I call for freedom of speech and full equality. But I don't hear God's voice. Maybe you do, but I don't. I have to satisfy myself with hearing the voices of human beings, hearing the voices of human beings who are suffering, hearing the voices of human beings who need equality. I cannot invoke God. It would be much easier if I could, but I can't. And don't talk about philosophers in the closet. Thomas Paine didn't sit in any closet. He went over and fought the French Revolution against the churches. He went and fought against the church in France because the church was what the revolution in part was fought against. And he came back not in the closet. He stood on the street corner handing out copies of his one-penny newspaper and of his book Common Sense. He was no closet philosopher. He was an activist defender of human rights who did not believe in organized religion. We've heard the parade of wonderfuls, and there are wonderful things that have been done in the name of religion. Great art, some of the greatest art, some of the greatest music, some of the greatest philosophy, some of the greatest moral principles. I don't dispute the fact that some of the greatest moral principles appear in the Bible. Tzedek, tirdof, says the Old Testament in Hebrew. Justice shalt thou pursue. Abraham argues with God over the sinners of Sodom. Hashofet kol ha'olam lo ya'aseh mishpat. The God of all the world will not himself do justice. The Bible is a wonderful repository of human justice, and we should respect the Bible. It is one of many sources of morality. It is not the only source. And when we think of it as the only source, what we do is we delegitimate and disenfranchise millions of good and decent people around the world who are seeking justice, not through salvation in some world to come, but here on earth to try to end the suffering, not because of some promise of redemption or some threat of damnation, but because it's the right thing to do. I throw a challenge out to you. What about people who don't share your beliefs in Christianity or in organized religion? What are they to do? You say you won't force them. Of course you won't. You can't today. But those who spoke with your voice 100 years ago didn't feel those constraints. And they did force people to share their views. What would you do with good, decent, and moral people who don't share your views, who don't accept Jesus, who don't accept Moses, who don't accept Muhammad? Would you disenfranchise them? Would you allow them on the Supreme Court? Would you vote for a non-Christian or a non-Jew or a non-Muslim for president if he or she were a good person? Or do you have an exclusivist view of religion that would deny any such person the right to be a moral leader? Would you allow a non-religious or non-believing person to be a president of a university? Somebody who has to instill moral values in students, a teacher in elementary school? Do you support the Boy Scouts of America, not on some constitutional or legal technicality, but if you were the head of the Boy Scouts of America, would you exclude from them people who didn't believe in God, children who didn't believe in God, or scoutmasters who privately and consensually engaged in a different form of sexual gratification from the kind you and I happen to prefer? I want to know what the programmatic implications of your views are, in addition to the rhetorical implications. I think it's very important for us to know what your program is, what it means when you suggest that religion has the answers. What do you do about the homophobia of the Bible, the sexism of the Bible, the xenophobia of the Bible, the racism of the Bible, the anti-Judaism of the New Testament, the anti-Islamic nature of much of Christianity, and the anti-Christian nature of too much of Judaism today? Recently, Judaism had to apologize to Christianity in a statement in the New York Times about some anti-Christian views contained within the Talmud and within other Jewish sources. What is your solution to these problems? How do we deal with them? How do we deal with the residue of what religion and organized religion has left in the world today? And how do you answer the Ayatollah Khomeini and his followers when they make your speech and when they promise your salvation through the eyes of a different religion and call for the destruction through force of religion that is different from theirs? They say if the Crusades were right, then why isn't a counter-crusade acceptable as well? What is your answer? What is your solution? What do you say to people who disagree with you? I pose that challenge to you with the best of intentions and with the highest of respect, but I think the audience is entitled to your answers to those questions. Thank you.
We will now have 5-minute closing statements. When the statements are finished, audience, please don't get up. Just sit. We're going to collect question cards, okay? Mr. Ambassador, please.
Actually, the answer to the latter question is very simple. I'd say, for God's sake, I'll respect your rights. That's exactly what is said. What I find interesting about folks who go through this litany as if there is some terrible danger from people who believe in God in America. How did we get here? How did we get to a situation where even the very mention of God's name in a public place is an embattled thing? Did we get here through legions of fanatical people battling to fasten organized religion on something? No, actually. We got here through a process that was pretty well allowed and tolerated by a whole bunch of people who believe in God and who were so anxious to be civilized and tolerant about it that they allowed folks to push the argument to such extremes that today we're the pariahs who are threatened with all kinds of abuses. And abuses they will be, too. Because at the end of the day, I want you to listen carefully to what Mr. Dershowitz said. The thing that bothers me about it is that he wants me to give up my reliance on God as the guarantor of my claim to dignity and instead rely on him and his good conscience. And I've got to tell you, I think Alan Dershowitz is a man who has some admirable qualities, and he and I have actually fought on the same side of some battles over the course of time. But I look back on a history that leaves me more than a little bit wary of the idea that I shall rely on the conscience and voice of the people as if it is the voice of God. For Ms. Dershowitz is all anxious to blame religion for everything. What my memory of slavery in this country is that it was actually enforced by popular will. It was voted by folks who had the right to vote and go fasten slavery on other people in despite of all requirements of religious conscience and decency. It was a conscience liberated from the need to respect the higher law of God, claiming, just as he does, that the Declaration is irrelevant, that all men are not equal, that things are going to go the way we say they go. And sure, a nice man like Mr. Dershowitz wouldn't throw me into slavery, but there are other people who sure have, and who would again. And the question isn't just what keeps them from doing it. See, he thinks that's what I'm concentrating on. And that's not what I'm concentrating on, because at the end of the day, there are going to be evil people in every generation. It's going to happen because of our fallen nature. I deeply believe this, and so something like that is going to threaten people everywhere and always as long as we're still living in the context of this fallen nature. Yeah, that's true. The thing that has always intrigued me isn't how you get into slavery. It's how you get out, see? And the reason that I am wary of all these folks coming forward now and saying, I wish there were unalienable rights. I wish there was a God who guaranteed all of this, and so forth and so on, is that wishes don't encourage people to brave death against slavery. But the firm belief in God surely did. I know, we like to pretend that the people were in the Underground Railroad and all these folks we talk about during Black history and so forth and so on. We forget that Mr. Dershowitz ridicules the idea of people who hear the voice of God and go out and do stuff. But a lot of those folks who were braving death and danger talked to God every day, did exactly what he told them. And what he told them to do was to go out and risk everything, in spite of the fact that they had nothing and were former slaves themselves, in order to bring people out of bondage. The weird idea that someone who stands up and respects the founders' belief that we needed a tribunal beyond human power that would guarantee to every individual, whatever their power, the courage and encouragement to stand fast in their human dignity. The idea that notion has some resemblance to fanaticism or tyranny or oppression or commanding or anything else shows how far some people are willing to go in order to score points when they don't have a point. The truth of the matter is that the people who braved the dogs in Selma came from churches where they prayed beforehand in order to do so. And I will look at the example of those folks who had been through every kind of fire, who had been through every kind of deprivation, who had been through eras when they had less than nothing, but who were able to hold on to the kernel of their human dignity because they knew it did not depend on the voice of their slave master, on the money of the beneficent liberals. It depended on God's will and God's judgment, and as their dignity came from his hands, no human being could take it away. I will stand with greater reliance on that ground than I would on the ground that Alan Dershowitz is offering. Because I admit that, a bunch of clever lawyers like Mr. Dershowitz can, as O.J. Simpson proves, can probably get you out of anything. But I warn you, deliver yourself again into the bondage that comes from allowing human power to lay claim to you in the absence of a divine power. And no argument by clever lawyers will get you out of that.
Thank you.